Good afternoon. I wanted to finish today with my reading of Sacred Chaos by Dr. Francoise O'Kane, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self. And this particular passage had a lot of gotcha items in it, so I hope you'll enjoy it. Toward the end, they really get stacked up, but anyway. So I'm reading from chapter 6, God's Wretched Servants, the Propitious Attitude. I would like to return on a more concrete level to specific dimensions of the propitious attitude. First, I will relate them to the Malagasy myth and then examine their place and then examine their place within individual psychology and everyday analytic practice. The first dimension is that of persistence, of the unflinching will to seek out and confront the unknown. In the Madagascar myth, humans at first seem to have no choice. The Father has made them his servants responsible for finding the sun. The Father has made them his servants responsible for finding the sun. Later, the tribe has an alternative, since they may give up after their efforts produce no direct results. But they go on searching, and thanks to the stubbornness, the earth becomes fruitful. This quality was prominent in Percival's quest as well. The very fact of his being on the way, his willingness to act, even if it did not lead immediately to finding the treasure, is enough to free blocked energies and recover some vitality for the psyche. When finally Percival the Fool asked the innocent question, "Whom does the Grail serve?" the land regains its fertility. In the Malagasy myth, there is no question to be asked, but the very absence of a question is significant. The tribe has to accept the incomprehensible and not even try to understand it. In both narratives, the search is more important than its aim. Does this not apply psychologically as well? Whether we choose to understand as much as possible or renounce rational explanation and trust the fool, in either case, and as soon as some ritual work is invested, psychic energy is released. What was blocked or seemed immutable cannot stay that way, since new elements have entered the picture. In Andrei Tarkovsky's film Offray, Sacrifice, 1986, a novice is told by an old monk to water an apparently dead tree on a hill. The novice obeys, although it takes him almost the whole day, every day, to carry one bucket of water to the top of the hill on which the dead tree stands. After 3 years, the tree starts growing leaves. One may object that above reflections are banal or obvious, but it is not so easy for either analysand or analyst to accept that in certain phases of the process, their task must be, just like that carried out by this novice, and that this apparently nonsensical act is psychologically essential. Analysts are sometimes tempted to eliminate insecurity by putting each case within the framework of a ready-made theoretical model. If we are not careful, we may start seeing in a client only the characteristics described by rational psychological categories and stop searching. Further, we sometimes go as far as to use Jung's very flexible paradigms of the psyche and its irrationality as a fixed mechanistic system within which a specific symbol automatically calls for a specific interpretation. We tend to see this system as endowed with the capacity to evolve in a linear, almost predictable manner, forgetting that this is our bias, forgetting that this is our own bias. Hello, Joshua, and hello, Brandy. Brandy, I have not gotten a chance to see the video. I'm going to have to look back for that link. And Joshua says, hey, Skip, may I detail a recent event that I describe as somewhat synchronistic? Either way, it was profound and emotionally charged. Joshua, you may go ahead and do so. I may not comment since I'm doing a reading today, but I may not comment until the end of the video. Or you can send it to skip.conover@gmail.com and I can comment privately. Reading on. Percival's quest, as well as the Malagasy search for the characteristics of the marginal period of initiation rituals, clearly show that these tendencies need to be balanced by an attitude that sees the path as far less clearly defined or less direct. Analysis must be a quest, as much for the analyst as for the analysand. An affinity for Eros and the Fool, together with an acceptance of penumbra and circumambulatia, together with acceptance of penumbra and circumambulatio, with all their paradoxes and contradictions, support the propitious attitude. One might remember the image of the boat sailing in concentric circles around the island in Miguel's dream. You won't remember that because I didn't read about Miguel's dream here. This attitude, by including the imaginary world, leaves space for feeling, emotion, and non-rational thinking. It is with the heart that one imagines. An attitude in which the process is seen as a quest through unknown territory rather than through already mapped terrain allows both the analysand and analyst to accept developments that, from a collective perspective and within the frame of rigid models, would be considered a mistake. Again, finding B while looking for A. The second dimension of the propitious attitude, that of patient surrender to the confrontation with frightening elements, is clearly expressed in the Malagasy myth. It is akin to the reversal of reality, accepted during the marginal period of initiation. The tribe has to accept the loss, the sacrifice even, of the dead in order to survive. The ego must partly renounce its own cosmos so that it can stay in contact with the self. It will also need to accept that the basic situation will remain the same. The work involved in the search for the sun will always have to be done anew. The dead will always have to be sacrificed. It seems to me, with regard to analytic practice, that this dimension corresponds to an attitude focused more on accommodating to the present than on an optimistic view of the future. For both parties in the analytic relationship, it gives up any promise of better times in which pain and doubt will vanish. This attitude results from choosing to live in spite of suffering and uncertainty. Patrick, for instance, is still experiencing a constant struggle, but he has stopped being a victim. Thus, though this perspective may seem pessimistic, it is fundamentally realistic. We have seen that it must also include a respect for the transpersonal forces at work and the avoidance of fascination or identification with the negative. Under these conditions, It may serve as a basis for the acceptance of personal destiny, transforming the analysan's existential situation by making it more than merely bearable, if not necessarily positive in collective terms. Of course, the analyst may unconsciously prefer to promise a cure, or at least give grounds for hope, trying to lead the client away from pain and doubt. It is difficult to tell someone that despair is justified and that perhaps meaning is to be found in the suffering, not beyond it. But experience convinces me that if we fall prey to the temptation of promising a cure, we simply rob the psyche. But my experience convinces me that if we fall prey to the temptation of promising a cure, we simply rob the psyche of a way of confronting darkness. In this sense, we may need to surrender with the analysans and suffer with them from not being able to offer any solutions. We ourselves need to practice the patient acceptance that, we hope, will allow passage to another stage. I will digress here briefly to examine the relationship between hope and despair in analysis and their influence on the work. Obviously, as I stressed earlier, hope is a potent antidote to suffering. Also, it is because one hopes for a positive change that one starts analysis in the first place, and hope will certainly contribute to the process. One may need to be careful not to attribute less importance to this dimension that in fact it has, but it should also be placed within a realistic perspective. The analysan's hope may be too much of an illusion when, for example, one believes that a few sessions will eliminate the pain. Then the problem is to ground the hope on a stronger foundation. Sometimes hope expresses itself through the extreme need for concretization. If I change this or that aspect of my life, my job, my partner, then I'll be fine. In this case, interiorization should be encouraged. In each case, neither analysan nor analyst need give up hope, but their hope must be channeled in such a way that it will serve as a motor to the analytic process. According to Jung, psychic events always have an aim, a telos. By encouraging the analysan to recognize and to respect the psyche's intentions, we help develop the feeling of being supported by a transcendent entity. Of course, and in particular with the cases we are interested in here, the psyche's aim or the path it chooses may not look as positive as the client may hope, but an awareness of underlying forces and an acceptance of the irrational reveal the soul's but an awareness of underlying forces and an acceptance of the irrational reveal the soul's dynamic nature. This dynamism, which James Hillman calls a sense of purpose and which he relates to a movement toward the future, is what carries the analysan's hope. In this sense, one may hope not for specific aims such as progress, individuation, or the elimination of symptoms, but for a movement within the psyche that makes the analytic process vital. In other words, the feeling of living in harmony with one's personal fate is, in itself, therapeutic. Together with the sense of purpose mentioned above, hope then counteracts resignation. The despair of the analyst constitutes another dynamic component in the transference-countertransference relationship. Within this dynamic, despair can be part of a fruitful analysis if, through emotions, the analyst joins the client on an archetypal level. However, the despair and its function may be insufficiently understood if they are seen only as a sharing of the analysand's feeling of being in a hopeless situation. In this sense, the analyst would help the client carry the burden by despairing with. Further, by really seeing and accepting the dark side of the analysand's life, the analyst can show they have value. These mechanisms may well play a role in any analysis, but it seems to me that the despair of the analyst also has a large impact. First, it gives dynamism to the blocked energies that force the analysand to submit passively to a negative fate or to identify with the darkest traits in his or her personality. From the moment the analyst starts genuinely to despair, the status quo is broken, allowing the hope that something may happen through the transference. Okay, let me go back and look here. Brandy says it is called iPad Go 2. It's made by Heliophan. Okay. All right, thank you for reminding me about that, Brandy. I did mean to get back to it, but it's been one of those weeks. I have one question for you. Do you think that natural selection occurred out of the elements of the divine chaos to create the divine order? I think that the divine order is implicit in the Godhead, I guess I would say. And so therefore, not particularly evolutionary per se. In other words, Dr. Jung once said that if everything were destroyed, it would all begin again. And if so, it can be ordered and unordered arrangement, an arrangement of a set of elements elected without regard to their order, meaning this would be the premutation of order itself. Well, I think from Dr. Jung's point of view, in the pleroma, which Buddhists would call the rigpa, the mind, the psychic background, there's no order whatsoever. And so the ideas of time and space are not implicit. However, events occur and they cause things to start to constellate out of that psychic background. And so they're not permutating out of order. They're originally from the beginning, from the very beginning now, they're coming out of nothingness into somethingness. And after that, it's sort of like pinball. If you think of the universe and how heavenly bodies have crashed together over 13.5 billion years. And so, okay. And I will do my best to take a listen to that video. I've been distracted today. But anyway, going on. Okay, I'm going to start from the top of this page since I can't figure out where I was. All right. These mechanisms may well play a role in any analysis, but it seems to me that the despair of the analyst also has a larger impact. First, it gives dynamism to the blocked energies that force the analysand to submit passively to a negative fate or to identify with the darkest traits in his or her personality. From the moment the analyst starts genuinely to despair, the status quo is broken, allowing the hope that something may happen through the transference. The analyst's admission of despair may also force the client to take a position vis-a-vis the threatening forces. On the basis of experience, the analyst will likely be able to face the lack of hope in a more focused, active manner than the analysand can. The client's despair may thus find new forms or new means of expression. At the same time, the analysand may observe and be influenced by the manner in which the analyst works on his or her own despair, if only unconsciously. This will provide the analysand with a model for possible new paths of action. Furthermore, in accordance with psychic compensation and enantiodromia, the despair shared by analyst and analysand may constellate other unconscious forces. It will corner the psyche, so to speak, in offering new solutions. Here, a dynamic relationship at the level of the unconscious may guide the analytic process along new lines. The analyst stops being the almighty healer and must trust suprapersonal elements to intervene. In turn, the analysand has to give up a one-sidedly hopeless perspective. And finally, what was said above about hope and the psyche's purposiveness also applies to despair. By encouraging the analysand to take an interest in his or her own soul and in the purpose of life, the analyst may help the other discover the meaning even in very negative symptoms, and thus also to accept moments of despair. Considering the matter of surrender as a helpful reversal of attitude, an aspect of the tribal rites of passage comes back to mind. The reversal of everyday life in which diametrically opposed dimensions coexist. It may well be that the refusal to promise better days to the analysand truly reverses the collective attitude dominant in the West, from which many clients have already suffered. The positive norms of health and happiness are terribly cruel to those who do not meet them. Further, they promote guilt, since everyone else is happy, and healthy, I must have committed some terrible sin, is the thinking that's involved. Let's see. Grenade says natural selection occurred due to the environment and life interacting with itself. It is theorized that all life evolved from one universal common ancestor, which I think is interesting, possible. Brandy says, what you said will definitely give me something to ponder on today. Okay. Indeed, the psychotics or schizophrenics' suffering results less from the frightening impact of visions than from the feeling of being excluded from society, unable to share them. Their pain is that of being deprived of interaction, of being pushed to the edges of the group. As for neurotic individuals, they often suffer from the feeling that others do not accept them. With regard to analysis, the alienation felt by the psychotic or the neurotic may be seen as a state like that of the novice, in which naive instinctive action must be taken in order to avoid total despair. And this may well involve for the analyst an acceptance of a momentarily reversed reality. Okay. That stopped for a moment. Am I still operating here? I guess I am. Okay. We have seen that the novice enduring the marginal phase of initiation and the innocent of the folktale must enter into contact with the divine child, with the instinctively complete symbol of the self. This aspect is not expressed clearly in the Malagasy myth, but it is implied. The tribe confronting its difficult existential situation cannot rely on conscious, rational decisions to survive. It needs to react instinctively and take apparently absurd action, like Lucky Hans, in order to avoid despair. This need even presses the tribe to do something that looks really foolish, since it keeps on knowingly sending messengers in vain. By the same token, Lucky Hans's bargains seem foolish, shortchanging him rather than helping him return home a rich man. The child who guides this type of reaction is connected with the unconscious, with nature, and with instinct. In spite of our professional work with the unconscious, we often remain too close to collective norms, materialistic values, and ideas of efficiency and progress to see what may genuinely be inspired by this child in the analysan's behavior. We are tempted to apply a model to work within norms that are concerned, on the one hand, with what is allowed, behaviors that are considered healthy, and on the other, with what should be the manner in which, within a Jungian model, conscious and unconscious should relate. Have we not forgotten the simplicity that would allow us to accept that for certain analysans, things simply are as they are, and that it may be just as well that they are? Have we not forgotten that the psyche has its own intentions? Specifically, I question designating as symptoms or resistances those behaviors that do not fit our developmental or analytical model. We are sometimes too impatient to make conscious, to integrate, or to help mature and differentiate. Of course, I am not advocating total freedom. The analysan lives within a society, and the limits of what may be accepted lie at the point where behavior may be prejudicial to other people. But at the imaginary level, so essential to our work, everything must be allowed and everything must be accepted. And at the more everyday level, the moment when an absolute open-mindedness may need to be replaced by a more active, intervening attitude should also be chosen according to the degree to which the analysand suffers from the concrete situation. However, if we accept that the suffering does not need to be only negative, this moment may well come later than we sometimes think. Further, if the analyst is not personally in contact with the archetype of the divine child, he or she cannot help constellate this archetype in the client. If we work within the frameworks formulated by the fathers within an evaluating and selective perspective, we shall not be able to help our analysans reconnect with the containing, nourishing mother. We have seen that in the divine child, both poles, light and darkness, conscious and unconscious, life and death, are very close to each other. The child knows because it contains both poles. Only this archetype can help heal the split resulting from a dichotomization or partial identification with one or the other pole of the self. This does not mean that the analyst's role is only to mother the child or to concentrate on the more childlike side of the analysand. This temptation to do so may well come from the unconscious preferences I have described above. There may be moments when a good deal of mothering will not go amiss, and I am not saying that the analyst should be cruel, but mothering can bring the work further only if, at the same time, a non-regressive childlike attitude is being constellated. It will lead further only on condition the analyst does not use the relationship mother mirroring narcissistic child as a model in which too little space is left for the psyche's spontaneous expression. The use of any theoretical model may bring a blockage as soon as it ceases being extremely flexible. Thus, the child must be there, but in its archetypal dimensions, and the work must be focused on the future rather than on the causalities of the past. Okay. Burnett says, order or chaos is a strange dichotomy, though, because at some levels, what might be seen chaotic can actually be ordered at another level, and vice versa. This is why it's paradoxical. Example, the Earth has perfect conditions for life, order, but most planets do not offer conditions to support life, and the conditions of Earth came into existence by chance, chaos. Yeah, fair enough. I'm not going to argue the point right now. Brandy says, I find it was very interesting, and I agree chaos is the exact same thing as order, also just an arrangement of chaos. And yes, we're thinking in terms of multiple dimensions here. The return to the land of childhood is healing only when it goes beyond trying to repair the faults that have been traced back. If anything, a regression to childhood must allow analysans to re-experience the emotions involved, and by integrating them into current life, help them bear fruit in the future. But they cannot be eliminated by a new developmental process effected through analysis. I must admit that I have difficulty seeing these emotions as simply providing causal explanations. I sometimes wonder whether the fashionable models of therapy that focus on mirroring are not influenced by the idealization of childhood that seems characteristic of our times. At this level, the child has become an imago, remote and sometimes cut off from its archetypal roots. It is to these roots that the analytic relationship needs to relate, not to the contemporary actualization of the child archetype. As for the lack of stable ego in some analysans, I would say that it is precisely those with a defective ego self-axis who, even more than others, need to reconnect with the less differentiated, more primitive contents of the psyche that are much closer to the self. If the analyst is able to use enough sensitivity and empathy, the ego need not react by blocking, defending, or decompensating. A large part of the process may take place at an archetypal, symbolic level, remaining impersonal for as long as necessary. The process may also develop in the background and remain inexplicit, unanalyzed, while the countertransference directs it along the right path. Not everything has to be put into words, especially for a fragile ego. The final dimension of the propitious attitude, that of the unavoidable confrontation with a cosmos and a self having both light and dark, destructive but also unfathomable aspects, is given by the very nature of the self. As I have stressed, this confrontation is indispensable to any passage toward another stage. Also, without it, there cannot be any vitality. We have seen in relation to Mary's case that the avoidance of this aspect can easily lead to partial suicide. What is more, although, and here I think she's talking about not a physical suicide, but just a decision not to go ahead with something that you might otherwise decide on. What is more, although I have been implicitly criticizing a perception of the self that makes it a loving inner guide, the self can still show one how to cope with the dark. It knows more about this dimension than the ego that refuses to relate to it. Let me return to the Malagasy myth. There, the negative pole is rather implicit. The earth is barren and death must be accepted. But God is not said to be malevolent as such. We have seen that the attitude encoded by the myth lets the tribe live with the dark pole and thereby attenuates its threat. In other words, humanity tries to live this wretched situation, no more and no less. But with success, objective reality changes and the earth provides food. The initial task, that of searching for the sun in order to avoid provoking the wrath of an unpredictable father, modifies the cosmos, and unforeseen evolution takes place. A hesitant, almost fearful gesture provokes unexpected and partly beneficial results. This stands in striking contrast with the hero's cutting off the dragon's head, or with the analytic attitude that sees the relation to the self as resting on a clear, conscious perception of the mechanisms involved, and relies on a will to progress toward more differentiation and more consciousness. Okay, 4 more pages, I think. 4 pages and a foot. Randy says, I find it was very interesting. I agree chaos is the exact same thing as order. We read that, just an arrangement of chaos. It is definitely a topic that I could ponder forever. Well, think of them as 2 sides of a coin, I think is probably the best way to think about it. Okay, reading on, page 128. I firmly believe that a genuine analytic approach must accept that answers might come from the devil, or that the Grail can be found without carrying a sword, perhaps even without knowing who the devil is or what the Grail promises. The analyst must be able to accompany the client's search without really understanding why certain galaxies are the way they are, or why black holes exist, by simply observing the effect of the measures taken or the reaction coming from the chaos of the self, and by participating in this action-reaction through the emotions constellated in the transference-countertransference relationship. Analytic work must accommodate itself to mystery and to shadows. It must accept them, especially when it becomes clear that, visibly, the earth is becoming less of a desert and the analysen's energies begin to flow again. The tension between eros and thanatos, between the vital and the morbid aspects of being, will always remain, but it can be accepted resolutely and with open eyes. Both analyst and analysan must thus choose to proceed with the analyst. Both analyst and analysan may thus choose to proceed with the client's destiny rather than try to modify it. They may also deliberately surrender to eros in its entirety, including its dark, irrational, and threatening aspects. Of course, for the analyst, Renouncing the security of progress-centered aims may bring a feeling that his or her work is inefficient. The analyst stops being all-knowing and the one who can repair the soul and show the way out of the shadows. The healer archetype is comforting, but it may also seduce one with its power. It may not be easy for the analyst to accept practicing a trade from which notions such as success, progress, and achievement have been eliminated. Obviously, the acceptance and sharing of the analysand's pain, the confrontation with sinister, dispiriting, or even desperate moments in the analytic relationship may also involve another risk. When the analysand's psyche chooses a path close to that followed by the aglyptic novice, it can be relatively easy for both partners to share the weeks or the months of patient meditation. But what happens in cases of progressive disintegration, the rotting away of Inanna's flesh on the stake? Read that again. But what happens in cases of progressive disintegration, the rotting away of Inanna's flesh on the stake? How loud will the analysand's screams of pain be? And where will the rage provoked by a feeling of absolute helplessness be directed, if not toward the analyst? In this sense, the right surrender may involve risk for the analyst, who stops being the loving mother and takes on a negative role. Whatever form the process of confrontation with the dark self may take, the analyst's aim is, of course, still to support the contact between the analysand's consciousness and the deeper layers of the psyche, so that an inadequately formed ego self-axis may redevelop on a stronger basis. It is also to help the analysand relate to his or her own soul, to the psyche that shapes one's fate. As we have seen in Chapter 3, one way to intervene along this axis is through imaginary representations. Narratives, symbols, and the marginal period of rituals are powerful means of communication between the ego and the self, and between the individual and the collective. They carry healing potential. In a developmental approach, where the analyst brings the analysand back through the various stages, primacy is given to the ego. The ego is seen as requiring treatment. In the perspective I am discussing, priority is assigned to the self and its archetypal level, that is, to the ritual work through which this level can be contacted. The analytic exchange takes place in the language of the mundus imaginalis. The silent dialogue circles around the self and aims at allowing the analysand to feel safe within a sufficiently complete archetype so that it can serve as a strong basis for a new separation of the ego along the ego-self axis. There is a return to the self so that the ego gets a chance to experience it in a more complete manner and eventually to feel contained by it in a way better suited to existential experience. I have here reached the limit of what I am able to verbalize, and there may be intrinsic reasons for this. First, much of what happens in the analytic vessel really is of an entirely nonverbal nature. It is also fluid and not easily trapped in schemas. A model can serve only as a global frame. It can only schematize and influence the atmosphere in which the exchange takes place, but it will never give proper account of the alchemistry of the sessions. Okay, well, in this sentence, she has the first two letters al in parentheses, so it can be also read as chemistry for those of you who don't know something about alchemy. So to finish this sentence once again, but it will never give proper account of the alchemistry of the sessions. Second, and this plays a far greater role, the questions I have touched on are part of a fundamental interrogation with a much larger scope, attempting to define the propitious attitude toward the self implies a deeper reflection on the place of humanity in the cosmos and the place of analysis within that context. Both issues, the ultimate function of analysis and the fluidity of its contents, are best reflected on by the analyst in privacy. The very verbalization of these topics structures the reflection more than the concrete work requires. It may even hamper the spontaneous emotional reactions that are so essential to the countertransference relationship. A genuine analytic attitude includes the ability to stand the tension between a need to understand and structure and the knowledge that the nature of the psyche will always interfere with this need. It must also realize that each case is different and follows its own dynamics. As Jung wrote, referring to the problem of the shadow, but I believe his observation is also relevant to the role of the analyst. Quote, "There is nothing that I can do except wait with a certain trust in God until out of a conflict born with patience and fortitude, there emerges the solution destined, although I cannot foresee it, for that particular person, not that I am passive or inactive meanwhile." Unquote. My attempt to define the propitious attitude is only aimed at finding a means to bear the conflict with patience and fortitude. I am also trying to compensate for the conscious standpoint's natural tendency to be active, to broaden itself, and to refuse to surrender rational control to the situation, for this tendency compromises the propitious attitude. Nevertheless, defining a propitious attitude may in itself involve the risk that as the elements inherent to the confrontation with the dark are being labeled and more consciously perceived, the ego, whether analysts or analysans, will fall prey to the illusion of being able to understand and again to control. Furthermore, it would be wrong to believe that recognizing the dark will inevitably serve consciousness. We have seen that completely integrating the shadow is an impossible endeavor. Facing the dark self in the terms I have described should be understood as a means for the ego to cope with the situation in which it finds itself, not as a way of eliminating darkness. This is an important distinction. Also, as we saw with respect to actually living with the despair of Gethsemane, it would be wrong, although maybe tempting, to believe that a resurrection following the crucifixion has been foreseen by a God who is, after all, loving. It would be wrong, too, to hope that an acceptance of the dark self can be used to bring more light, that its contents may be controlled by logos. What I have in mind, deriving from my experience with analysans, is rather that this acceptance brings a new form of consciousness that is, in fact, akin to non-consciousness. It brings a non-rational awareness of the psychic reality, which corresponds more adequately to the nature of the soul than is generally understood by the term consciousness. It applies the form of thinking characteristic of the natural mind, the spirit of nature that tells the truth without relying on book knowledge. The myth of the Malagasy may be used here once again. Once it is accepted that God or the cosmos is not only good and nothing, once it is accepted that God or the cosmos is not only good and that nothing one does will modify this fundamental fact, one can find the means of living in such a cosmos and a way of relating to its deities. This does not bring an understanding of what God wants or of what the cosmos is, nor even the certainty that God's intentions are loving, but it does allow survival and gives people a place in the world. At a psychological level, accepting and facing the dark self does not bring happiness, and whenever it brings the hope that light may triumph over darkness, this hope is either an illusion or the result of an inflation. Nevertheless, in my experience, it does bring peace. A transformation takes place in which the analyst may acquire an intuitive knowledge of the world. I am tempted to write an almost cosmic consciousness that allows one to feel, to know in the sense of gnosis without understanding, that he or she has a place, a just place in the cosmos. One no longer feels like a victim of nefarious powers and discovers a place along a transcendent, sacred continuum that reaches far back beyond the personal, linear time. The longing for a Godhead able to contain and to accompany everyday existence, for a God who may confront and relieve existential fears, is fulfilled through the experience of this participation. According to Hillman, one is then in contact with the anima mundi, with the cosmic psyche, and this According to Hillman, one is then in contact with the anima mundi, with the cosmic psyche, and this contact relieves existential tension. These remarks may sound mystical, but it is difficult to use a different tone when talking of problems that reach into the very roots of life. At a more concrete, everyday level, we may simply say that the propitious attitude toward the self may be seen as a means of helping an individual reach this form of consciousness, away from the norms defining progress, reason, or normality. Thus, one takes responsibility for one's own vitality and experiences it in a subjective manner. I would say that psychic health is just that. The ability to go into one's personal fate, to fully accept it, even if it seems rather negative and brings suffering. The image of the novice's stones comes back with all its simplicity and depth, the slow, patient work of rubbing through which the stones imperceptibly wear down until their monotonous song allows the novice to contact the bones of life, the skeleton carrying both life and eternity, and lets him reconnect with a fundamental, primitive source. According to Jung, this reversion to the primitive, or as in India, the uninterrupted connection with it keeps man in touch with Mother Earth, the prime source of all power. Seen from the heights of a differentiated point of view, whether rational or ethical, these instinctive forces are impure. But life itself flows from springs both clear and muddy. Hence, all excessive purity lacks vitality. A constant striving for clarity and differentiation means a proportional loss of vital intensity, precisely because the muddy elements are excluded. Every renewal of life needs the muddy as well as the clear. That is the end. So I've been reading from Sacred Chaos, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self by Dr. Francoise O'Kane, published by Inner City Books. I'll look and see what we have in the chat. Grenade says, why do psychoanalysts regard certain religious experiences or experiences of the self-archetype as regressive? Sorry if you already went over it. I think what we're talking here is these are more primitive, instinctual ways of being, and as such, they're regressive. I mean, we see it in our politics right now, for example, where suddenly all of the rules that we've all thought were working for society for the last 250 years are thrown up into a cocked hat. And the result of that is that half of our society has become much more barbarian, let's say. They've regressed to an earlier level. And so they need to be invited back into the community of normal living so that we as a collective can move on successfully together. We all have to be together. And so the regression is primitive. Okay, yep. My wife is indicating to me that I have to take my mother-in-law to a doctor's appointment, which is true, but she's 10 minutes early, so I have a couple more minutes here. I hope that that's helpful, Grenade. That's the way I see it anyway. Randy says, the onion order part of natural selection is a combination of elements that does not take into account the arrangement of the elements when natural selection occurred. Yeah, that may be true. I'm not terribly clear on the onion order of natural selection, though. That's not my specialty. So Brandy says, which meaning that the order is not important. This is just a random thought. Well, I mean, I think that sometimes the order is important and sometimes it isn't. Obviously, we're not going to jump from, directly from fishes to little furry creatures to human beings without a lot of stuff in the middle, and that's a kind of onion that develops step by step. But I think that biologists, and I've talked to Gray Yates about this, who's a biology teacher and is one of our subscribers here. He sometimes talks with us. He points out that in evolution, if everything was left to just random selection, completely random, we couldn't possibly have evolved. So what has happened is that in evolution, there have been jumps. And so when we talk about the missing link between humans and great apes, as an example, there are probably a lot of missing links, or there was something special that happened at one time that allowed a leap from where the great apes were to where we have been developing. And it's more than just Neanderthal, because um, I think it's fairly accepted that we are all also descendant from the Neanderthals. Um, so the point I'm trying to make here is that evolution is not necessarily just layers of the onion, but somehow sometimes things develop more quickly because of something unexpected. And Mady says, hi all. Brandy says, and that was meant to say the unordered. Okay. And Brandy says, I absolutely love this book. I absolutely love this book too, because we don't have enough writing about the shadow and helping people understand their shadow. So it's very useful. Grenade says, humans aren't actually super different genetically from the apes. Yeah, we're not super different, but we're enough different so it's not just a random thing and all of a sudden we're off and running. If that were the case, then we'd have lots of species that have developed off the great apes, but in point of fact, we only have our species that is developed off the great apes. And, so for example, there's millions of species of fish, but in terms of primates, we're the only one that developed reflective consciousness, let's say, or at least at the level that we're at. I mean, there's some evidence of that in apes, and chimpanzees, and so on, but very little. Okay, I have to excuse myself. My personal commitment is upon me, so I will see you all another time. Take care.